Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to this press briefing, which is going to be on the 2023 macroeconomic performance and outlook and the study of inclusive growth and sustainable development. I have to say hello to those who are watching us on live stream because I know that we have colleagues who are joining us, and thank you very much for joining us. Our panelist today comprises His Excellency Ambassador Albert Muchanga, who is the Commissioner at the African Union. We also have Professor Kevin Urama, who is the Acting Chief Economist and Vice President at the African Development Bank. We are also very honored to be joined by Honorable Minister Situmbeko Musokotwane, Member of Parliament, and Minister of Finance and National Planning in Zambia. So the way we will proceed is Commissioner will speak first, then we will go to Professor Urama, and then we will end up with Honorable Musokotwane. Thereafter, we will go into our question and answer section. So without much ado, Commissioner, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Director of Ceremony. Greetings, members of the media. We are always happy to be with you so that through you can reach out to people who are interested in African affairs, including ordinary citizens. We had two events this morning. One on the rollout of the first edition of Africa's macroeconomic performance and outlook. This is a publication of our colleagues from the African Development Bank, but in a spirit of collaboration, it was first rolled out earlier, and it is being rolled out again here at the African Union. We facilitated, and it went on very, very, very well. I will not say more. I'll leave it to my brother here, Professor Urama, to give you a few details. With respect to the study on inclusive growth and sustainable development, last year, let me say, the chairperson of the African Union Commission and the president of the African Development Bank reached agreement that we need to have a study on inclusive growth and sustainable development. If you look at the African Union Agenda 2063, the first aspiration is a prosperous Africa anchored on inclusive growth and sustainable development. So we want to translate that aspiration into something we can realize, achieve by coming up with this in-depth study. And when the AUDA-NEPAD measures where Africa is on all the aspirations and goals, you find that on their first aspiration, which is on inclusive growth and sustainable development, is about 40%, which is below. So we needed to really beef up. And this is also necessary because although we currently have positive rates of growth, they are not adequate to reduce poverty. Our population is also quite relatively high, averaging about 3.5% per annum. So we need to double that, which is 7% and above. And the consensus emerging is that it's possible if Africa really takes action, especially with regard to investment in various areas, human capital, infrastructure, and business development, among others, including preservation or conservation of the environment. It's very, very, very possible. So this time around, we brought in our colleagues from across Africa, and we have a consortium which is undertaking the actual writing of the study. And the person at the head of this technical working group is Professor Urama. You'll say more at a later stage. And our target is to conclude the study by 31st March this year and submit it to the next meeting of the Assembly of the African Union Heads of State and Government in February 2024. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Over to Professor Urama from the African Development Bank.
Thank you very much. First, let me thank His Excellency Albert Muchanga for his unwavering support and leadership to finding innovative solutions for Africa's development. I also want to thank His Excellency, the Minister of Finance and National Planning from Zambia, who is representing the President of Zambia, who we're happy to see would want to offered to be the champion for the study on inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa. So I want to also acknowledge the teams that are working with us across the world to try and move these agendas forward. As His Excellency Albert Muchanga has already mentioned, we had two events, one on rolling out the macroeconomic performance and outlook for Africa for the year 2022, and also looking at projections for 2023 and 2024. Just to summarize, what we see in the Outlook report is that Africa has remained resilient, and despite the global headwinds that we see around the world, the COVID-19 impacts that ravaged economies in 2020, 2021, Africa rebounded to 4.8% of growth in 2021, and in 2022 still maintained a positive growth of 3.8%. And from what we are seeing, we're expected to stabilize around 4% in 2023 and 2024. That's a very good trajectory to see, given that Africa is still low in terms of rates of vaccination, currently at about 26% of the population, way below the 60% of herd immunity, that to reach herd immunity. So with that, we see that the continent has really implemented a number of policies across the regions that has helped the continent to be able to maintain a positive growth rate. And this growth rate actually outstrips the growth rate estimations for the rest of the world for the same period, which is 2.7% for the global average GDP growth rates. So Africa is doing better than the rest of the world on average. And compared to the other regions, we're almost at par with Asia, that's also having a positive rate of growth and stable outlook. Another thing that is heartwarming in that report is that despite all the challenges that we had, the COVID, the climate, and also the conflicts that has created volatilities in the global markets, and also breached supply chains, especially for energy and food, leading to rising inflation in energy and food prices, and also the continued challenges of COVID-19 that we've talked about and regional conflicts. The continent maintained a positive growth, and 53 of all the countries in Africa maintained a positive growth rate with a very stable outlook. And this is a very positive thing to see. Then the other point is that 5 countries in Africa have now returned to a growth rate above 5%, precisely about 5.5%. And these countries, therefore, are returning to the 10 highest growing economies on the continent and globally, which is a positive thing to see. And compared to the pre-COVID pandemic era, we're also seeing that the growth rates of Africa currently at 3.8% is much higher than 2.9% we had in 2019. So we're actually moving back to pre-COVID era. We see also that inflation was highest in 2022 at 13.8%. But then, though it's the highest in the past decade, we're seeing that due to monetary policy tightening across the continent, that inflationary rates is also going to be seen as going down, reaching lower, being single digits by the year 2024. Currently, we have about 19 countries that overshot its inflationary targets, but we also have other countries that have done very well. And a lot of the impacts has been because of the tightening of the global financial markets, and then also the appreciation of the United States dollar, which has very clear transmission effects on the cost of capital in Africa, and then also on currency devaluations for most countries on the continent. But the good news is that Africa's diversity gave it resilience. So we see these challenges affect different countries in Africa, but also some other countries benefit. Like when you talk about the energy price inflation, the countries that are energy exporting countries benefited from that. But energy importing countries lost out. So, but when you net it, you find that Africa is still doing well, and that is what we saw in many areas of the African economy. So, whether we talk about fiscal deficit, current account balances, inflation, and exchange rate volatility, the continent is in a very stable footing compared to the rest of the world. So, just to put it in perspective, the rest of the world, most countries are really at the verge of a recession in many economies around the world. But we don't have that fear in Africa so far. But we say that this is with cautious optimism because we know that there are still Africa's economy is exposed to the global trends, and so long as we have those global risks continuing, we cannot rest in our laurels and hope that we have done well. And as our brother have already said, the 3.8% was not good enough to prevent people from slipping into poverty. So we have 15 million Africans that slept into extreme poverty in 2022. That's adding to about 60 million that went into poverty in 2020 and 2021 because of COVID and so on. And if this war in Ukraine continues, we may see further people still going into poverty. So, and that calls for a number of strategic policies, bold policy actions in terms of monetary and fiscal policy management that works in tandem by reducing inflation, but also not discrediting or destabilizing the SMEs, and also impacting on the more vulnerable economies more than necessary, but also other policies on domestic revenue mobilization, public financial management, and strategic industrialization policies like local content policies and franchising policies to add value to our natural resources. This is a very important one because Africa owns a lot of the resources that will drive the green industrial revolution. And Africa needs to input technology, digitization, and other policies you will find in the report that will help the countries to benefit more from these resources rather than trading on raw materials going forward. And then the study, which is the second event we had, thanks to the leadership of His Excellency Musa Faki Mahamat, the chairperson of the African Union Commission, and Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, the president of the African Development Bank Group. That study is already responding to one of the key findings of the macroeconomic outlook report, which is that Africa needs to invest more in key areas of capital. Infrastructure capital is one of them, so we need to build more roads, rails, and seaports in order to improve the reality of the Africa Continental Free Trade area that we have agreed on. But also we also need to invest in human capital, especially retooling our youths and women and deriving from their innovative capacity to be able to drive productive investments on the continent. And then also in environmental capital, basically harnessing natural resources more. But to do all these things, we have to focus on mobilizing more low-cost, long-term financing, because the higher cost of borrowing we have in Africa has significant risks that are facing the continent. And as journalists, I know you will ask for what are the risks that we are facing on the continent. One is the global recession. We are not an enclave. We work in a global economy. So we worry to see that countries in Europe and North America who are trading partners are facing significant challenges. So the pass-through effects on that will continue to be something that we have to watch. But we also have the challenges of debt, which remain on the continent, especially because of the appreciation of the US dollar and the fiscal tightening that we're seeing around the world. So the cost of repaying even existing debt will be increasing, and countries' debt obligations will increase even if they don't borrow more. because of the exchange rate effects on the cost of capital and so on. But also the cost of borrowing more to invest more will be higher because the age of low interest rate that we have seen since the financial crisis in 2008 is gone and may not be back in the next decade or so. So the reality of getting financing in order to do development will have to be rethought very carefully. And then also the global financial architecture in itself discredits Africa in many ways. The rating agencies, as we've heard, once you are downgraded, the cost of capital goes up in your economy and it becomes a spiral. So it becomes more expensive to borrow and more expensive to service your debt. And then you go into austerity measures and it's just a spiral into poverty. So we really need to think carefully about how to address some of those global risks that we have going forward. But one which is a low-hanging fruit for me is the Africa's over-dependence on exporting raw materials. This we can stop very quickly by implementing just two policies. One is local content policies, simply insisting on the local content of your exports to make sure that if it's copper, for example, because we have Zambia here, insisting on not selling raw copper, but copper concentrates will increase the revenue by almost 100%. So we need to be strategic about such things, but it requires investments so that we can process that copper and so on. And then to draw that investment, my recommendation would be what I call franchising policy, because maybe the Zambian minister may not have the fiscal space, but the Zambian government can have the political will to insist on not exporting that copper, because the world needs the copper. So if you insist on making sure that you create franchises for conglomerates to come to Zambia and invest in the processing until that local content requirement you've made is met, the businesses will come because it's a win-win for them. They will locate industries near raw materials, so it removes logistic costs. It's also good for the environment, but because it removes the shipping costs of raw materials and the shipping to buy the processed products, but it also creates jobs for the economy, and they gain access to cheaper labor. And with different fiscal and policy incentives, it is very possible to bring these people in. We've seen that happen in China on rare earth minerals. We have seen that happen in Vietnam. We've seen that across the world. So we can actually borrow from some of those things. So let me stop here and we'll take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Orama from the African Development Bank. Now it is my honor to invite Honorable Minister Situmbeko Musokotwane from Zambia, and he's the Minister of Finance and National Planning. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, and it's a pleasure to be here. Zambia, we came because our president was invited to come and participate in these processes, and I'm representing him. We have already heard that there are two things that happened today. The first one was on the macroeconomic outturn and projection for the future. On that one, my brief remarks is that we welcome this initiative. We welcome this initiative because it will tell us how we are doing as individual countries, how we are doing as members of particular regions. You compare yourself with what your colleagues are doing. And of course, it also gives us an opportunity to compare ourselves to the rest of the world. So we welcome that. Of course, in saying so, I'm also aware that there are already other institutions that do this exercise. Many of you will recall that the World Bank does something similar to this. The IMF does something to this. But when your own local institution also does the thing, it provides another perspective from the local situation. So we look forward to apart from comparing ourselves, we'll also be watching carefully what you, our bank, say and what the IMF and the World Bank are saying, and if there will be any variations, why? And if we are all the same, we'll still ask you the questions. Why are you all saying the same things? You are conniving. So we welcome this initiative. The second activity that was taking place is on the commissioning of the study on on the growth of the African economies. A study that our President Chilema, was asked by the AU and the African Development Bank to be champion. To be champion means he is the one that must chase around and make sure that this work is done and it is done properly. So as champions, we were invited to come and see the start of all of this. We welcome it because, colleagues, I think, as you all know, yes, there's been positive economic growth in Africa, but this growth is nowhere to satisfying the aspirations of the African people, especially the youth. Formal sector employment in Africa is very low. There are very few countries where you can even talk about 40% formal sector employment, which means for most people, they are in the informal sector. Not that it is bad, but the typical informal sector in Africa, the earnings and the level of engagement is normally much lower than what you find in the formal sector, which means the African youth, they are boiling inside. They want to do something. They want to be engaged. They want to have proper incomes. And in these days of internet, even in the villages, people can see how people in Europe live, how people in China live, how people in America live. They can see. They can follow. And then because they are not satisfied within their own region, what do? You see these sometimes waves of migrations of African youth. Some of them crossing the Sahara Desert. Some of them making dramatic moves to cross the Mediterranean Ocean to go and look for better livelihoods in Europe. And of course, you see how much they are handled in a manner that is not acceptable because they cause inconvenience for other people. So I think as African leaders, we are never happy to see such kind of things to happen. We want the African youth to be engaged, to earn incomes here in Africa so that none of us is humiliated because of these economic refugees. And this study, I believe, is going to go a long way to identifying the factors that can help us to follow the lead of our colleagues in Asia. In the 1960s, 70s, the economic conditions in Asia were worse on average compared to those in Africa. But one by one, they followed a similar trend. And today, the Asian youth are a very proud lot. So there's a lot that I hope we are going to draw from those experiences and get that to be emulated in Africa. So we look forward to the conclusion of this study, and much more beyond that, we look forward to the implementation, which is our responsibility. And we take that very seriously. So in short, this is what we came here for as Zambia. In representing our president, we are happy about the outcome and look forward to further progress in these two areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think this is a wonderful press conference because right here we have the political buy-in and assurance and commitment, and we also have expertise in terms of the analysis and perhaps going further, the implementation of this topic that we are discussing. And for those who are just joining us, we are discussing the 2023 macroeconomic performance and outlook, as well as the study on inclusive growth and sustainable development. It is now time for us to take your questions. Please show your intent by raising your hand. And then if you're asked to speak, tell us your name and the agency that you are representing. I am to get further advice on how we can handle those who are joining us online, because we should be able to give you a WhatsApp number to which you can send your questions, which we will then put to the principals here with us. All right, colleagues, let's see. Meki, there's one. Do we have somebody else? Two. All right, let's start with you. And please just tell us to whom your question is directed.
Thank you very much. Fan Junwang from China's Guangming Daily. I have two questions. Number one is that what's your response or reaction towards Professor Jeffrey Tuck's early remarks regarding the borrowing or debt? He said that the debt is not an issue or not that important compared to more borrowing, more investment in the education. Second question related to the Professor Ulama. You mentioned that Africa should stop export raw materials. So do you think when the African countries will be instructed to do this? Thank you.
Professor, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. That's really very important questions. On the food crisis and the opportunities that creates for Africa, that's really spot on. In my presentation, I quoted Albert Einstein, who says that in the middle of every challenge are opportunities for innovation. Now, Africa holds about 65% of remaining cultivable arable land in the world. That tells me that Africa should be the food basket for the world, not the food importer that we are now. So what the African Development Bank has been doing is during the crisis, where the president of the African Development Bank, President Akinwumi Adesina, worked with the African Development Bank Board of Directors and senior management to launch a food crisis response plan for Africa, which was a $1.5 billion intervention. And that funding was not supposed to support import of food or food aid and so on, as you would normally think of. It was actually focused on trying to boost the productive capacity of African farmers so that we can produce the food we need. So through a program of the Feed Africa strategy that we call Technologies for for the Transformation of African Agriculture, TAT, we help to mobilize and procure improved seeds, improved inputs, to get it to the farmers, fertilizers and other inputs to ensure that productivity can grow on the continent. And this country where we are in, being Ethiopia, actually has, through that Technologies for African Agriculture program, massively increased the production of wheat and basically drought-resistant wheat. And we have it in Sudan, your country, and many other countries that program is intervening in. So our focus as African Development Bank is in boosting factor productivity on the continent, not food aid. We believe, as if I quote President Adesina again, when we had the food summit in Dakar, Senegal, that was hosted by himself and the president of Senegal, who is the chairperson of the African Union Commission. And that place we had worked with countries to develop food compacts. So that's compacts that actually has clear plans on how each country that participated in that program can actually boost that productivity that we're talking about, but also had boardrooms to mobilize resources to support that compact. And that's what we heard those were there in the morning, the president announcing that as of today, about 35 point something billion US dollars have been mobilized in interest to support those food compacts. So this proactive action by the bank is because we believe that there are two goals for Africa. The low bar is for Africa to feed itself. This one is a no-brainer. There is no reason why Africa, owning 65% of arable land in the world, 60% of population being youthful population with energy and everything, high innovative capacity, should be importing food. So that's one. But the higher bar, which is also achievable, is for Africa to feed the world, because owning 65% of arable land means that this is the place for Africa. The future of food in the world actually depends on how Africa treats its agriculture. So, and that is why the fertilizer investments in fertilizers, in improved seeds, in technologies for agricultural transformation are key for Africa. And the rest of the world, for those who are listening, investors, my call would be that we should go to where the resources are. Locate your agricultural investments in Africa, because there you have the access to labor, you have the access to land, you have the access to water, and also 1.4 billion people, a market that is supposed to be fed. So domestic market is large, and opportunities for exports is also large. Is Africa utilizing that opportunity that is created by this crisis? Yes, to some extent, but I would like to see more acceleration in doing that. And that is why the president of the African Development Bank is not resting in his laurels to push for investments to grow in Africa. We mobilized that 35 point something billion at the Dakar Food Summit. Is that enough? I would say no. We need a lot more investments to flow into that sector so that we'll be able to do what is required to modernize Africa's agriculture. Is that good enough in terms of achievements? That's excellent, because it's one of its kind. We have not really seen that happening. So it's a step in the right direction. We need to do more of that. On the debt issue, Jeffrey Sachs' point that Africa is not actually heavily indebted is very correct. If you look at the quantum of debt, the quantity of debt on the continent compared to the quantity of debt in other countries and in other continents, then Africa is not really heavily indebted. Just look at the debt to GDP ratio of the United States and other regions of the world. You will understand why I'm trying to say that. But the other point here is that it is not debt that is the problem, but the quality of debt that is the problem. So if you are borrowing short-term, high interest rate debts with short maturity terms, and you are using it for infrastructure, it's actually built to be bad debt from the beginning, because the infrastructure return rate may be 30 years, and you are required to repay your sovereign loans in 5 years. Where are you going to get the money from? So the yield curve from the investments that you're making is not good enough to pay back the loan. Then it's bad debt. And that sort of loan should never happen, should not be encouraged. But then if you're borrowing to do what Jeff was talking about, which is to invest in human capital formation, in productive infrastructure, and then you're borrowing long-term, low-cost loans, 30, 40 year, 20, 30 year term loans, then you have the chance for that investment to pay off the debt and still leave development dividends for you. So in that case, debt is good. So it's about whether it's bad debt or good debt, and that depends on prudence and decision-making, clarity in decision-making, and understanding how to negotiate those debts are also by countries. And that is why the African Development Bank Group established the Africa Legal Support Facility to support countries in those debt negotiation and debt reforms as we go forward. So because Africa needs quantum of investments to be able to grow its economy at the rate that is required to pull people out of poverty, there is no question that Africa needs to borrow. But also, when you don't have good governance or good institutional frameworks to regulate how you borrow and what you use the money to borrowing for, then borrowing can go into consumptive expenditure, which then becomes bad debt. So the question here, that what Jeff is advocating for, is that we should try to have sustainable borrowing, smart investments that actually pays off. Because without that, no country actually grows without debt. So that debt is an important aspect of what we need to do. But how you borrow, what you borrow for, and how you use the debt, the money that you've borrowed, is very crucial. And to do this, the African Development Bank Group and the IMF and World Bank and several institutions on the continent have established the Africa Public Financial Management Academy that is helping countries to actually do exactly what we have talked about. So that's one of the things that we need to think about. But also one other thing that Jeff said, which I fully agree to, is that, you know, the switch to commercial borrowing in Africa is very worrying. So for me, what worries me on Africa's debt situation is not the quantum of debt. It's not even the debt to GDP ratio. It's actually the structure of debt. Because currently, sovereign borrowing in Africa, the proportion of commercial loans has grown larger, up to 40%. And that 40%, that means the shorter term loan, higher interest rate, 13, 15%, it's really very difficult to make them good loans, good debt. So we need to think through that as we go forward. Then finally, the last question on the export of raw materials. When do we think Africa should be at the stage when they will be adding value to raw materials? For me, it's yesterday. It was actually the year of independence of any country, because it doesn't make sense. Our analysis have shown that of all Africa's commodities traded in the global markets, only diamond and gold has some form of incremental growth in its real price since 1960. All the other ones, the actual price, the real price, is going down. So when you are exporting revenue, you are exporting jobs and employment of your people, you are exporting welfare, and you're actually getting indebted to those who you are exporting to.
Thank you. On the issue of debt, of course, in general terms, African debt is lower compared to other continents, but you must put that in context. The context means that the debt that you've collected, the debt that you've incurred, the debt that you've borrowed, it has terms of how you pay. And the reality for a country such as mine, Zambia, is that the interest and service charges for all the debts that we have are unsustainable for our budget. Okay? There's no doubt about that. This is why we've had to embrace what is called the common framework, because this is the arrangement that should help us to be able to bring the debt payments under control. In the absence of that, if we were to pay according to the terms, then we'll fail to provide education, we'll fail to provide health, we'll fail to provide infrastructure. So one must put things in context, and for us, the debt has become a problem and it needs to be solved. Of course, hand in hand with that, we have to grow the economy so that it can handle a bigger level of debt. But for now, the debt is a problem. Very briefly on the issue of food, yes, the war in the Ukraine is an opportunity. And for us, our answer is simple. We are opening up space, because many times we say we have a lot of land, we have a lot of water, and so forth. But those by themselves would not be appropriate for attracting investment. you must put infrastructure there. You must put electricity, you must put roads. And for us, this is what we are doing now. And then we can invite investments from our local people, we can attract investment from international investors. And don't forget, to export food, you must be competitive. Under the current technology where you are producing groundnuts with a hoe or beans with a hoe, you will not be able to compete with Brazil. You produce beans, but they will rot in the markets because you will not be able to compete on the international market. So we are taking practical steps to make sure that investments is encouraged on the land. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Minister. Commissioner?
Very briefly, because I have to rush to another engagement, just to say that complementary to what the African Development Bank is doing, and we are going to merge the two. We have a program called the Common African Agricultural Parks Program, which is aimed at facilitating investment in agribusiness intercountry-wise. The latest example is between Zambia and Zimbabwe. Then we're also monitoring closely the debt situations across Africa. So to this end, we are establishing within the department what we are going to call the African Debt Observatory, so that we get real-time data on what is going on around the country, around the countries of Africa with respect to debt management. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank our panelists for today, His Excellency Ambassador Albert Muchanga, the Commissioner for Economic Development, Trade, Industry and Mining at the African Union Commission. Let me also thank Professor Kevin Urama, who is the Acting Chief Economist and Vice President of the African Development Bank. And also a big thank you to Honorable Situmbeko Musokotwane, Member of Parliament, who is the Minister of Finance and National Planning in Zambia. Mostly, let me thank you, colleagues who've taken the time to join us, and also those who are joining us online.